You are listening to Radio Alla Mundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixicker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer, and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Alla Mundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Alla Mundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioalamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook, search Radio Alla Mundi. The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are free to introduce themselves and speak their minds openly in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects, without any paraphrases or expectations. So, let the story go on from there. This story is about a man by the name of Américo Mendoza Mori. He is behind a project and a podcast entitled Quechua at Pen. It consists of talk shows in the Quechua language about all kinds of topics. Even the show notes of the podcast are in Quechua, which is taught at Penn College, the State University of Pennsylvania. And at some point, the name of Américo Mendoza Mori appears on my radar screen in one of my online notifications. The reason for the alert is that someone else is going to take charge of Quechua at Penn, whereas Américo Mendoza Mori is going to move on to another project and teach Quechua and Indigenous and Hispanic Studies at Harvard. When I read his bio on the internet, I learn that Américo originally comes from Ica, a Peruvian city located about 5 hours south of the capital, Lima, if you follow the Panamericana Sur, the Pan American Highway crisscrossing South America. As part of my own travels, I have had the opportunity to learn some Quechua and even speak it as part of various recorded interview projects that included indigenous Quechua speakers. So, an interview with Américo Mendoza Mori should be an opportunity to dig a little deeper into the language, how it works, and the culture behind it. Harvard is a big name, and so is Américo Mendoza Mori, who even has a Wikipedia page. And I have to admit that I'm a little surprised when I get a quick response to my interview request. It doesn't take too long for us to set up a time for the interview. And so, a few days later, Américo Mendoza Mori is speaking to me from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it is 9 a.m.
Yeah, during the summer we were working with 6 nations in the Toronto area, and like upstate New York and also Ontario. So that was my first collaboration with Canada, and specifically with Canada at large, but also with Indigenous peoples of Canada. We prepared an online course on indigenous traditions of knowledge, and with many educators from different like First Nations. So it was a very nice experience to learn more about them, to learn more about their traditions, because we had to kind of like the idea was they had to teach like module seminars on let's say festivities or art, but many of them they were like elders. They were not necessarily educators, so our duty was to kind of like facilitate examples, so then they could record themselves and find, for example, to put an example, they were thinking on their I forgot, I think it was the Mohawk. They had a Thanksgiving celebration, but that had nothing to do with Thanksgiving. That, like, let's say, so, but so for example, we like I told them, I mean, non-indigenous people, when they hear Thanksgiving, they think of the turkey and the other things. So it would be very interesting to actually make a comparison on what is your kind of Thanksgiving that have nothing to do with the other one that is more mainstream, ironically. Yeah. My name is Américo Mendoza Mori. I'm connecting from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I teach and do research on Latin American and indigenous issues at Harvard University. And I am located in the time zone of the East Coast of the United States.
So, Américo Mendoza Mori and I have decided to speak English rather than Spanish. Still, after the usual introductions, I just decide to switch to Quechua for a while and introduce myself to him that way, just to see how he is going to react.
Ayin Punchai, Suteja Marco, Kanata Manta Kani, Imai Sutiki.
Ayanmi Sutika Américo Mendoza Mori, Noja Peru, Suyumanta Kani, Kunanmi Boston Yastapi Kachkani.
So when you hear me speak Quechua, what do I sound like to you?
Well, like you are learning, right? That you are you're a language learner. At the same time, it's great because we need to, let's say, one of the stereotypes of indigenous languages is that they are in a survival mode, and therefore the main key is to just nurture the people who belong to that community. But we don't think that about other languages. It's totally normal for people who don't belong or have no connection with, let's say, French culture to learn French or Spanish or English. So having what in linguistics we call L2 learners, like learning Quechua as a second language, not as a heritage language, is also very important because it gives visibility and why not even allyship, because it's a way to engage with the language and the culture.
How does it work in Quechua when it comes to names between your typical sort of European name and a traditional indigenous Quechua name?
I would say that the priorities on each culture varies on how do you introduce yourself, of course. For example, in Quechua, people are more likely to even first say where are they from, like where they belong to. And that could either be like their community, which in Quechua is the IU, or the region. Well, I would say that maybe in other places, it matters more first to say what do you do, where do you work at. So the positionality in a context where community is so important then it becomes a key description when you are meeting someone. And that also happens in other communities. For example, in the Navajo Nation, that's also a similar case. I was learning from a friend that even when describing where the person is coming from, if the person is mixed, let's say half Navajo, half European, then that's also an important information to facilitate from, let's say, second one. So that shows a lot on how belonging from a community matters. And I would say that for Quechua is also an important aspect as well.
Listening to Américo Mendoza Mori's response in Quechua, I understand that he doesn't just repeat the way he has introduced himself in English earlier. This time, it is closer to the indigenous ways of getting to know each other, and Quechua is the language that allows Américo Mendoza Mori to hint at his background, which we explore a little more shortly afterwards.
What's your cultural heritage like?
Well, I am Peruvian. I am from Peru. As maybe people can tell from my accent, English is not my first language. I was born in a coastal city called Ica, which is a few hours south from Peru's capital. But also my mother is from the Amazon, from a city called Tarapoto. So I like having this, let's say, both heritage. Like in the coast, there were many cultures that were not Incas, but there were the Paracas, the Nazcas, and it's more like desert context. While the Amazon, of course, has a different geography and different traditions. But specifically in the Amazon, in the region from where my mother is from, there's a variety of Quechua that is spoken. And I'm mentioning this because maybe for people who are not familiar with Peru, they might not see it as a big difference, but usually people associate Quechua with the highlands, with the mountains. So it's let's say, having a heritage from the coast and from the Amazon, to me was is a reminder that Andean identity goes beyond certain, let's say, harsh divisions that actually were imposed when the Europeans arrived, right? Like now in Peru, when people describe themselves geographically, they might say themselves, "Oh, I am from the coast, but I am not from the Andes," or "I am from the Amazon, but I am not from the Andes." But now now that I've learned more about my own history as Peruvians, how even the Incas interacted with geography and different resources, and even, let's say, in Ica, my home region, the oldest pan flute, the quena, up to date, was found in Ica, which is an instrument that people tend to associate with the highlands. Only. So now I am more comfortable seeing myself as Andean, for example, which in Peru, that's even today that would be a bit contentious, because we in school we have been trained in a way that we make these clear distinctions, but we are still in the process of embracing the diversity and how fluid was the exchange between those regions.
Please tell us a story about your ancestors.
Maybe thank you. Maybe I can start with something that recently happened to me in when I was visiting my hometown. I was in Ica a few months ago, and I was meeting with some of my cousins. And just to make a clarification, in Latin America, cousins are anyone who are in your generational level. In English, I am still not sure what cousins are in English, because I think they're only the kids of your siblings. But anyway, so cousins, and that's why we have big families, because, or big sense of what a family is, right? So anyway, I was meeting with cousins in Ica, and yeah, they were asking me like the kind of work that I do, because I mean, I don't come from a family of like academics or scholars, so it takes time always to kind of like explain why I actually do to other people who do more, let's say, like they have more like jobs, practical. I don't want to say it's an impractical, but let's say more concrete experiences of working. And they were asking me, well, so you work on Quechua, and so yeah, I know that you go to Cusco and like places that we clearly associate with the Andes or with Quechua language. But I was like pointing out that I actually just passed by and like few streets in my hometown, and many of the places, even the gym, the local gym, had a name in Quechua. So the idea, the conversation I was having with this cousin was that even though it's there, even though it's in everyday life, even the name of a gym is in Quechua. So it's not like we're even thinking of, oh, this cultural space. No. Quechua and Andean culture is there on everyday life. But we are still not seeing that. And we, at least in the coast, we are still kind of like rejecting unconsciously that. We need to kind of like be intentional about finding that. Tell us a lot of our legacy of coloniality, on how, even though it's there, and maybe even a foreigner sometimes that comes with, external eyes, might be easier to put the pieces together. We as a society, because of discrimination, it's not just like a coincidence, we have found the strategies to detach ourselves from those cultures and languages. So I'm starting with something recent to then maybe look at the past, in the sense, or to previous experiences, in the sense that I started working with Quechua because I've noticed that it was very present in the experience of living in Peru and being Peruvian. There are many words in Spanish that come from Quechua and we use a lot. And at the same time, I was studying literature and language. And then I noticed that due to the amount of words in Quechua or expressions that we use in Spanish, we could qualify in general as heritage speakers. There's that category in linguistics. But we don't necessarily see ourselves that way in Peru. Because again, why to identify with something that leads to discrimination or a potential obstacle of opportunities? But I would say the opportunity and the privilege to reflect on that made me connect to say, actually, no, I mean, this should be an asset. And an asset, not just for the, let's say, the sake of cultural celebration, but because by recognizing Quechua and Quechua culture, basically we are being honest as a society that this is who we are, and also to even be a more democratic society, because right now in Peru, 1 out of every 10 Peruvians speaks Quechua. That's almost 4 million people. People who, many of them, they might only speak Quechua, or they might feel more comfortable on speaking in Quechua, and they deserve rights, access to healthcare, to education, to justice. And because of the status or the perception of the language, that's limited. So what it can be a personal experience of personal celebration and connection. Like I of course have to say that by connecting, learning more about the Andes, learning more about Quechua, learning more about also my heritage in the Amazon, I feel happier and more connected. But at the same time, I would say it's an opportunity for community empowerment and even to strive for a better and more democratic society, especially because, and as you can see, I'm trying to look for the bigger picture, because it's still in Peru and cities like Lima, for example, the capital, it's still very easy to just detach themselves from the Quechua or Andean heritage, because that's how we have been taught to do. So I don't even try to make it a personal case, but more like, hey, you live in a country, regardless, because so many people might say, oh, I have no connection with Quechua, or I have zero connection with the Andes. In Peru, I would say, hey, maybe more than you think, but let's assume that that's the case. Well, then let's look at the numbers. Let's look at how present Quechua is in society. Let's look at how millions of people who are, in theory, citizens of Peru, unfortunately, they are not citizens in terms of rights access. So we all can contribute to care about this for the sake of building up a better society.
So, the Quechua language is much more widespread than most people would tend to believe, way beyond the Andean highlands of Bolivia and Peru. Going on from there, we go back to an earlier topic, Thanksgiving, as a millennial indigenous ceremony down in Peru, and the corresponding concept called Aini in Quechua.
So Aini is practice of collaboration and reciprocity, and we can say that it's a practice, but it's also philosophy. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also a scholar, so one of my goals is to also work with, let's say, incorporate indigenous philosophies into academic conversations. And why do we strive to do that? Well, first, because it's a platform that now operates for the spread of knowledge. And historically, the study of indigenous cultures has been more of like, let's say, an approach of the study of the past, or the study like more classical anthropology, like kind of with a bit, let's say, of exotism. But we don't do that when we approach to Greek philosophy or Latin philosophy. We know that they might be ancient, but we see the relevance, we see the contributions, we see the legacy of that. So when I approach to Aini, I'm explaining this because when I approach to Aini, I look at it as a practice of reciprocity, of course. Is the sense that, yes, people are reliable, people from your community, and you're expected to also be reliable. But at the same time, there is an ontological component and that it can be useful not just for Quechua people, but it could be useful for society at large. Nowadays, we have important conversations about individualism, isolation, or what kind of paradigms do we want for society. And suddenly, Aini could be one of many venues to rethink the ways on how we build up society. So in that sense, it could be both a practice that it already happens in the Andes. To put concrete examples, when there's the time of harvest, maybe you need an extra hand. So people might collaborate, but then the person who helped you in that moment, maybe next year will need to build a new house. So of course you're going to be there for that person. But it's not like people are counting favors. No, it's more like this is the dynamic of being reciprocal and being part of a community, and to be part, which the word in Quechua would be ayllu. Ayllu might translate as family, but actually more like larger family. Your community could be your IU as well. So that would be a definition of Aini.
Another keyword reflecting indigenous values and principles is Summa. Basically, it is one of the Quechua words for beauty, but its real meaning goes way beyond and includes ideas and practices like harmony, balance, and even the pursuit of happiness. So, the most trivial things in daily life rely on spiritual connections in an indigenous community. One of the ways the Quechua language expresses that is by adding mama, mother, and tata, or father, to everything, including trees, animals, mountains, and so on. The spiritual connection then consists of what the Navajo people refer to as walking the land in beauty, a concept that translates into Summa Causai in Quechua, literally, live in beauty. And I have always thought of that as an ancestral version of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is one of the founding principles of the United States.
How would you match the North American concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with Summa Causai?
Well, I think that Summa Causai literally translates as the good life. Ayin means good, and or Summa or beautiful. Some people say Ayin Causai, some people say Summa Causai. So Ayin could be good, or Summa beautiful, and Causai means life. So the beautiful life. And that's a philosophical and why not even political conceptualization on saying that there is a different way of approaching the future. So in what sense is a utopia? And it's okay to have a utopias, because that's kind of like, and in that sense, it's a philosophical proposal, because as any philosophical proposal is a utopia. I am pointing out this because sometimes when people hear the aspirations of Summa Causai as this notion of living life in a good way, in communing with the environment, putting emphasis on reciprocity, collaboration, and sense of belonging, people might say, well, but that doesn't sound like something realistic. And I'm like, well, wait a second. First, this is a conceptualization, and it's okay that other communities deserve utopias in order to aspire for a better society. The same way we do it in the West. There have been so many utopias in the West that lead ways of living. To put an example is, for example, I live in the United States, and one utopia that is still very present on how people make decisions is American exceptionalism, which is, for those of the people who are not maybe in the US, is the idea that the United States is this exceptional, unique country that has the responsibility to lead the world. It is a utopia, certainly, but there are real life policies implemented based into that. So in that sense, Summa Causai is a utopia, is a philosophical outcome, but that is also leading or pushing for actions, for policies. And that has been manifested in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia, that they have incorporated Mother Earth or Pachamama into the constitution, recognizing that, let's say, that's kind of like like an ontological approach of seeing the earth not just as a place where we take resources, but approach of, we actually belong to the earth, and therefore we should be more thoughtful about that. It's a different approach, or let's say is a valuable approach for example, contemporary conversations on climate change. It's also an opportunity to talk about indigenous rights, indigenous lands, or territories, and so on. So in that sense, I would say that summa causa is, yes, in general term, this philosophical view of a communion or harmony with the earth, and also collaboration and reciprocity, but at the same time that is pushing for these specific policies and initiatives to make sure that we keep cultural diversity. And as I just mentioned, there's the case of the Constitution of Ecuador. There are the push for indigenous rights. There's the push for bicultural, intercultural education, and so on.
So, indigenous values and concepts expressed in keywords are a focus of Américo Mendoza Mori's job as a teacher of indigenous studies at Harvard University. But he also has a political agenda, which is to bring about social change and raise awareness about issues like climate change. It all starts by listening to the stories told by indigenous elders and the songs performed by native children.
What was your favorite children's song or nursery rhyme?
Well, something that I teach students, because I also teach the language, is a song that Peruvian writer and scholar Jose Maria Arguedas was able to find when he was traveling the Andes. It's a song that allows people to learn body parts, but it's also a children's song. But I think it takes us to many levels because, of course, it's an enjoyment song for kids. The name of the song, it has two names for people who might want to Google them. One is called Arber Hasarui, and the other one is Takiyakui. But Arber Hasarui is the most common name for that song, and learning about that song and now teaching it makes me think of how even from the very basic moment of growing, like lullabies, we still need so much to reconnect. There is the Carnegie Hall in New York. They do have a project known as the Lullaby Project as a way to celebrate different children's songs. Because right now, I mean, what do we sing to kids? Maybe we sing Baby Shark, right? and that's good. I mean, nothing wrong about that. But we have kind of like lullabies have been kind of like monopolized. Like it's hard even to think of lullabies from Quechua. So this Arber Hasarui or Takiyakui, they are one of those few that are widely known, at least for kids. And so yes, so learning about that and now teaching it, that was very, very, very important, and it made me think about how from the very first early stage of life, having that available and connected, it can be so important for people to have that cultural sensibility or a sense of belonging. I won't sing the song. Sorry, because I'm not very good at singing, but I can say the lyrics, which is the lyrics say T'akiakui, T'akiakui, Maki Chaikiwan, T'akiakui, Saruikui, Saruikui, Chaki Chaikiwan, Saruikui. And the kids, while they do that, Maki means hands, and T'akiakui means to clap. So the idea is that it also is an interactive song for kids. And then Chaki means foot, and Saru is stepping. on the floor so people can interact while singing that song.
Eventually, I branch out a little bit and mention a young student of Spanish at an international elite school in France. When I told her about my upcoming interview with Américo Mendoza Mori, she openly wondered how come she had never been told about the Incas, their culture and mythology, and about Quechua, the language they spoke, and that has survived up until this day and age.
Well, thank you so much for that question, and I really love that we remain curious about knowing more and more about the world. I think we need to work on what, let's say, the technical word is to work on cultural and language prestige, which it might sound a bit superficial in the sense that every language, every culture, every tradition should be appreciated on its own right. But the reality is that there has been structures and historical legacies that have created those hierarchies. So we need to be intentional about looking for that. This person, of course, is very young, and I'm really glad that already at that age is trying to go beyond the traditional approach of learning, but basically is teaching us, this student, that today what we need to do is to actively look for new perspectives, because that will be so important for them to incorporate other traditions of knowledge. From for those of us who are a bit older, then we can contribute by facilitating those conversations to put comparisons and analogies, because as the student mentioned, yes, every culture has a mythology, every culture has traditions, and therefore the more we know, the more we can appreciate the diversity, yes, on one hand, but at the end that we're all part of the human family.
So, rather than just being a question-answer session, our talk is a real exchange that includes Américo Mendoza Mori's background and heritage as a Quechua speaker. We even have time to discuss a question that has been on my mind for many years about a food item, or better, a snack, one can generally find in gas stations.
Where does the word jerky come from?
Yeah, well, I don't have much idea, but one thing that I was casually told is that at least in the US, people identify jerky with the west part of the US. And the west part of the US was, which is now California, was part of the Spanish Empire. So probably there was exchange of people between the regions of the Spanish Empire, and this is how we got maybe people from South America going to the west of the US, and then that's how we got the word. That could be one way. I don't, but I don't know. I don't have a secure answer on that. But you bringing up that word, for example, that it's so popular, as you said, like you go to a gas station in the US and you can get jerky, could be an opportunity to see the presence of Quechua and other indigenous cultures. I do research on language, and I think that words are one way to start noticing the presence of cultures. In academia, for example, we use a lot of words in Latin, in Greek, in French that do have translation into English. But why do we keep those words in those languages? Carpe diem, quid pro quo, vis-a-vis, because it's consciously or unconsciously is our way to acknowledge that there's a tradition of behind those words, that there's culture behind that, and by doing that, we also acknowledge then the the contributions of that particular tradition. So that's why, let's say, bringing terms like Aini or Summa causa, connecting with your previous questions to the public conversation, is not just for, saying, okay, we have these abstract philosophies, but those philosophies or those words, or recognizing that in everyday words we have words that come from Quechua, like jerky or quinoa or llama or condor, then should then lead us to step 2, which is to say, okay, those words come from this tradition of knowledge. Where are those voices? And then hopefully enrich conversations with more voices that can offer those perspectives. Going back to the topic of climate change, whenever we see those conversations, the COP or the Paris Accord, how many indigenous communities do we see there? And not protesting outside the buildings, but actually inside with a seat at the table where decisions are being taken. So that initial exercise should lead us to the incorporation of different voices, because there are already important voices that could be present and should be present. Just to put an example, this month I'm taking this semester. I'm teaching a seminar on indigenous language revitalization and global indigeneity. And I incorporated the term global because for some people still, like, indigenous feels like a very local niche aspect, but it's hard still for us to picture how indigenous issues can play into global platforms. I just mentioned the case of climate change, for instance, but then the other step is, okay, we agree that indigenous issues can be global issues, but where do we see that manifested? And for example, the United Nations has an office for indigenous issues, and this month we are inviting a Quechua diplomat to Harvard, so that person can talk about the work they do, the issues they're pushing. They just started the UN decade on indigenous languages, so many countries across the world can implement issues at this global scale. In the case of, for example, Canada, that there was a Truth Commission that has been part of the national conversation about the abuses and boarding schools against different indigenous communities, and now that's part of Canada's national conversation, and therefore it should lead us to have global conversations on that particular situation, like the exclusion. I mean, probably one of the reasons we know about the case of Canada is because of the visibility of the country, their aim for more scrutiny in their history, but that has also happened in many other places. So, and I think, for example, Canada is now more aware of that, because they are, for example, now with their presidency at the UN, they are trying to make indigenous reparations part of their, maybe not everyone, but an important part of people in Canada are trying to make indigenous reparations part of their foreign policy conversations. In countries like Peru, the Embassy of Canada, they are investing and they're giving grants for people to develop projects in indigenous languages. So it's an interesting moment to see how indigeneity, indigenous issues are becoming not just local and niche aspects, which surely they are, but they are also playing a role in the global stage, and we should listen.
But eventually, our conversation has to move on to the end. We do have time for a reading performance of a poem written in Quechua, though. The author's name is Octavio Diaz Mendoza, and there couldn't be a better way to wrap it all up. So, the story goes on from there.
Pachacutej tagtayay, kamachejni inkayay, may pinkashan munaykiki, may pitajmi kuyayniki, mark'aykita mast'aripspan, Tawantinsuyuta, wiñachirqanki, awqa sonqo runakunataq, llaqtanchikta ñak'arichinku, qoya suyuq yawar weqan, inkakunaq unanchasqan, qhanta punin waqarimuyku, Peru suyu ñak'ariqtin, maypin kachanki Pachakúteq, maypin llamp'u sonqo kawsanniyki, waqmantapas sayarimuy llaqtanchis suyu qespinanpaq.
How would you teach this poem to a foreign audience, and what can they learn from it?
Well, this is the first time I'm reading this poem, but the message here is, of course, the look for Pachacútec was a key Inca for the history of like the Andes. So basically, this is a looking of like where is he now in the sense of like of what he represents, the culture, the sense of pride. So I think maybe that conversation would be like the look for that pride represented in Pachacútec. In reality, it's not just about that person, but it's about how sense of pride or belonging or assertivity Quechua people should have today, despite of all the discrimination. So hopefully that can be a way to talk about the value of culture for the future. Yeah.